I'm Matt.
I'm Shane.
And if you like what you hear, make sure you hit that thumbs up button real hard, and make sure you subscribe to Comic Movie Marks.
And also click that little bell for all of the notifications.
Whee!
Always remember,
if Trailer Trash can do it,
anyone can do it.
Hello and welcome everyone to another Comic Movie Marks video.
We have a doozy of an episode for you today. We are talking about unreliable sources and how many of them there are.
Shane's back, ladies and gentlemen.
Guess who's back?
Back again. Shaney's back.
Tell a friend.
That's right, we're going to talk about unreliable sources, the day and age where the almighty source might be unreliable. I think this facet of the source or insider has been around forever, and it's in all aspects. But we're the Comic Movie Marks, so we're going to talk about it in the movie aspect of it, and maybe somewhat of the wrestling aspect as well. Over the past couple years, it's become more of an issue, I think, for these journalists, and the attempts of the studios to actually crack down on leaked information. Quite an interesting time when it comes to the source or insider.
Yeah, it's definitely been weird to kind of see the chess game now that's going on with studios and how that links to the journalists and social media.
So something that came up recently that I thought was quite funny was a rumor about Aquaman and Wonder Woman possibly being in the Flash movie. And of course, this all had to be up to Jason Momoa and Gal Gadot whether or not they would actually do this in the movie. So this rumor alludes to possibly being a Flashpoint style of movie. That would be an obvious role for Aquaman and Wonder Woman to be in. And you have someone like Grace Randolph, for instance, saying, yes, I can confirm rumors are true. WB would like hashtag Flash movie to feature Wonder Woman versus Aquaman to wipe out Justice League, but Gal Gadot and Jason Momoa would need to agree. With Ezra Miller, I think it's a big ask. We'll see.
Then a one Humberto Gonzalez chimes in and says, according to inside sources, there is zero truth to that Wonder Woman versus Aquaman rumor in The Flash.
Sit the fuck down.
Both posted these almost at the same time. Who is actually right? Who has the proper source? Are they both just being f***ed with? That's my guess.
What it kind of reminds me of is when movies have to film under code names to try to mislead some of the journalists. One of the most common ones, and possibly one of the first movies to ever do it, was Star Wars Return of the Jedi, that filmed under the name Blue Harvest. And this was for multiple reasons. I know they were trying to avoid from any journalists catching wind that they were filming the third installment of Star Wars, and they also were trying to avoid locations increasing prices due to knowing that, oh, it's a Star Wars movie, they can pay whatever. So they had to film under Blue Harvest to avoid multiple facets of this going against them. Eventually it came out once they saw, oh, here's some of the characters obviously all together. Now they know it's a Star Wars movie. But those are some things that studios have to do to try to avoid from anything being leaked.
One of the most infamous campaigns to mislead people on the facts is release the Snyder Cut. And as I said before, this story about the Snyder Cut is possibly going to be more interesting than the actual movie itself, because the campaign that WB went through, the hoops they jumped to try to get people off this trail, and a lot of it was done by WB. A lot of people trying to keep this information locked and keyed, which is crazy to think when you have that many people working in a studio. How are you going to be able to hold this information to yourselves? But they've done quite a bang up job, and there's still people that believe there is no Snyder Cut. One of the biggest examples of the campaign to mislead people was from the Wall Street Journal and Ben Fritz. One of the famous paragraphs from that article was, who are these people who won't stop talking about this magical Snyder Cut that doesn't exist? Lamented one person close to the film.
I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
As we've seen over time, it isn't a magical Snyder Cut that doesn't exist. It does exist. But this Wall Street Journal article did a lot of damage, and it had a lot of people against the idea that the Snyder Cut existed, because a lot of people took this as final word, but it wasn't.
Well, why the big secret? People are smart. They can handle it.
The person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it. 1,500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew The Earth was flat, and 15 minutes ago you knew that people were alone on this planet.
Imagine what you'll know tomorrow.
In June of 2018, Mark Hughes from Forbes was adamant that the Snyder Cut did not exist. Then fast forward to November of 2019 and his tune had changed when he wrote an article stating, "Dear Warner Brothers, release the Snyder Cut."
In the article, he says, first, let's be clear about a few things. Yes, a Snyder Cut does exist in a near finished form. Yes, several people have seen the Snyder Cut. Yes, there were multiple edits of the film, including an early assembly cut, which Snyder confirmed was 5 hours long. But Snyder and his crew continued working on the film and created a more completed version. Hughes continues saying it's also worth noting that there was indeed a sustained campaign to convince everyone that no Snyder Cut exists, with some people intentionally spreading false information to mislead the press and public, while others spread the false information because they were misled by their bosses or sources and had no other evidence at the time to convince them otherwise.
Article continues, I'm not sure what compels some media and journalists to continue denying the Snyder Cut exists after a great deal of confirmation, nor why some of them insist it will require tens of millions of dollars to complete. Claiming the Snyder Cut doesn't exist or that it's a mythical entity whose existence is unlikely or in serious question relies on ignoring the claims of most people who worked on Justice League and who insist that yes, it does exist. It also relies on ignoring the folks who actually saw the cut of the film and relies on ignoring all of the footage and images that have steadily leaked out to the public over the past several months. Saying it doesn't exist or treating its existence as a matter of debate then inherently implies a vast conspiracy exists to fool everyone into thinking a movie exists for the purpose of what exactly? What is the supposed motive for so many people to make false claims and to generate images and footage for a supposedly non-existent film?
Well, we're waiting.
And going back to his tweet from 2018, he says, I say all of this as someone who initially didn't think a true near complete Snyder Cut existed, since in the early days of the situation, I believed the sources who told me only an assembly cut existed and that Snyder didn't continue production in the time leading up to his departure from the project. At that time, there was almost no leaked information or images to suggest a more completed, longer cut existed. Most of the movement for releasing the Snyder Cut was rooted in faith and assumptions, which at the time were in contradiction to evidence being provided behind the scenes to those of us in the press. That's a key part of this article. Evidence being provided behind the scenes to us in the press.
He also says, I have obviously seen and heard more over the past year, including new images and footage and sources with more information about what happened, a more accurate timeline of events during Justice League's production, and revelations that some folks at the studio were misled about the true nature of the Snyder Cut. Some people who originally told me it didn't exist later contacted me to let me know they had merely repeated what they were told at the time, but they had since learned a Snyder Cut exists. As a result, my understanding of the situation and my position have changed, which I began saying publicly a few months ago.
And the truth shall set you free!
This is what makes the Snyder Cut situation very interesting and almost once in a generation. You have a studio, for whatever reason, is misleading people, trying to show that no, this movie does not exist, even putting little nuggets of information out there to mislead people thinking, no, there's no hope, a Snyder Cut does not exist of this movie. Makes you wonder, why would they do something like that?
And yet one of the biggest arguments that I've seen about the Snyder Cut and its release is that if it existed, they would have already released it. If you've been following this at all, the people behind the scenes have issue with it, either with the movie or Snyder or both. And if certain circumstances aren't true on Snyder's departure, it makes them look even worse when it comes to the PR that wraps around this situation. That's why they're hesitant about releasing it. But now AT&T is the godfather and they don't give a shit about their feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings. To stick with Senior Mark Hughes, something else that happened with him when it came to that old reliable source was the Robert Pattinson casting for Batman. Originally, when Pattinson's name was being passed around, a lot of people thought it was fanfare. Turns out many months later, that rumor was true. So in an article from Mark Hughes, Robert Pattinson to star in Matt Reeves' The Batman, one little part that was in this article talking about Pattinson's casting applies to this topic, saying Pattinson's name has been circulating for almost 4 months, on and off, with some outlets claiming to have seen or been informed his name was on the list of actors under consideration for the role. When I inquired with multiple sources a few months ago about Pattinson as a contender, I was told it was just fan/press rumors, with other performers, notably Holt and Taylor Johnson, suggested as top contenders instead. Likewise, for months, I consistently heard Reeves was trying to keep the search to actors 25 to 30 years old, and the casting would likely fall within that range. He continues, now, however, it's obvious those details were probably a distraction to avoid the truth leaking too soon.
A little bit further down in the article, he talks about, regardless of why, I was obviously completely wrong when I reported, again, based on assurances from many top sources, Pattinson's name being in the mix, and the folks and outlets reporting his name were right. This isn't the first time facts about solo Batman project leaked out and were aggressively denied by sources, including the studio. When I and others started getting information from multiple sources that Ben Affleck was going to quit as writer and director on the Batman, I was assured by other highly placed sources Affleck wasn't going anywhere, and the rumors of his departure were false, and then several days later, his departure was officially announced. He continues, that said, it means obviously we're all in a new era of reporting as well, and so I'll need to be more careful about accepting even strenuous studio denials and more willing to run information I hear about, possible casting and story elements regardless of denials or attempts to stall me running stories. It's all part of the job and the game, and going forward, we all have to accept the changing realities and respond accordingly.
To also talk about Pattinson's casting, Mario Robles from Revenge of the Fans, who once again has a decent track record especially when it came to Justice League information and some of the inside stuff going on at WB. He was adamant that Armie Hammer was the top contender.
The studio wanted Armie Hammer, and they wanted that name out there. I don't know why, but that was their pick. That's who they wanted. Maybe they just saw him as more the natural sort of Bruce Wayne type. Whatever the case may be, that's who they wanted, and that's the name they wanted out there. And a lot more people than just myself heard it. There was considerable amounts of conversations between folks who worked at DC and folks who worked at Warner Brothers about the fact that Armie Hammer was who the studio wanted. Now, of course, at the end of the day, they had to concede to whoever Reeves wanted, because Reeves had full creative control, and he had that whole power play early on in the process. So at the end of the day, Reeves would get his guy no matter what. But at the end of the day, the studio was hoping for Hammer, and they were kind of sounding those alarms out there, and there were enough people who were starting to hear about it that someone was going to run it, and it happened to be me. And you know what? It didn't work out. It is what it is. Because to the best of my knowledge, Reeves never actually fully even considered Hammer. He was always just the studio's top pick, and they wanted that name out there. And even in the middle of all this, the Hollywood Reporter has already confirmed that he was one of those names that was kind of floating around there in the conversation. That's where Warner Brothers wanted his name to be, in the conversation. And I was just the poor schmuck who took the bait, and I'm the one who put the bullseye on my head and published that story.
So he was duped, hoodwinked, shellacked,
bamboozled
into reporting Armie Hammer because he was the studio's choice, and the studio was trying to put pressure on Reeves, even though Reeves has full creative control. If it wasn't for WB's constant fuck-ups, Reeves probably wouldn't have creative control. They kind of put this upon themselves, but yet they still feel adamant they need to have a say in somebody else's movie.
A lot of people ask why. Why treat the customer this way? Why? Because fuck them, that's why.
So we've talked about this tweet thread a while back, and I had it in the description, but it becomes more prevalent than ever with this topic. So it's a tweet thread by editor-in-chief of Den and Geek, Mike Cecchini. Spicy meatball, give me a cololini. Yippee!
Yeah, there we go. Here we go.
The reason why we're laughing is because we had to put that through how do you say this name thing, and the way the voice sounded was super Italian. It's like Cecchini. Like,
I'm a number one.
Buongiorno.
so this thread is in response to the Obi-Wan Kenobi series being canceled, then being reported, no, it's fine, and then a week later being canceled again. And Mike talks about the difficulties of having integrity and still running one of these sites that lay out these scoops. This is kind of a long thread, so bear with us. This is going to be reading time with the marks, and you're going to love it, every bit of it. Our voices. Maybe I'll deepen the voice, add more bass, get some Barry White up in here. So this Kenobi news is disturbing, not so much because it's another sign that Disney is really adrift with the Star Wars planning, no shit, but because of what it means for how this stuff is handled by studios. Bing, turn the page.
Last week, rumors had been circulating that the Obi-Wan show was in trouble. Various journalists reached out and were assured that wasn't the case. And yet now, here we are. I get that spoiler culture is distasteful for studios and PR is king, but clearly good folks were lied to. Bing, turn the page.
This has happened to me in the past when I tried to report on an unfortunate rumor that was circulating. And it was flatly told everything was cool by the usual sources close to production, only for the exact opposite to turn out to be true a few days later. Ding, turn the page.
What I'm getting at is that when real sources won't even tell the truth to folks in my biz on background, it just further incentivizes some of the worst sites out there to just flat out make stuff up. It makes it even harder for me to say, don't run this, it's BS when stuff pops up. Bing, turn the page.
The bigger problem is the more you link to the BS, even when you say take it with a grain of salt, which is the laziest, most important disclaimer to absolve yourself from running BS for clicks. Whatever benefit you get from it, they get infinitely more because SEO. Ding, turn the page.
So when a, quote, trusted journalist who plays the game and does their due diligence can't get clarity, and our jobs are increasingly on the line because of the whims of Google algorithms, we are increasingly forced into a corner where it becomes even harder to justify actual standards. Bing! Turn the page.
And I will seriously take a frackin' unemployment check before I'll link to thus reward some of the ridiculous crap out there. But studios PR seriously need to reevaluate how they handle some of this, because it's only gonna end up biting them in the ass eventually too. Bing, bing, bing.
Of course, in the grand scheme of things, getting clarity on a Star Wars or superhero movie rumor is insignificant, but as we are seeing in the everything is literally on fire real world right now, when nothing is true, then anything can be, and there are consequences for that. Bing! Another turn the page.
Very early in my tenure as editor of Den of Geek, I nearly lost my job because I drew a line in the sand about a ridiculous rumor from a disreputable site that outlets who absolutely knew better picked up because it was at the time when everyone was still drunk on clicks. We got it covered. Ding! Turn the fucking page!
But if I reach out on something now and I'm told, nah, it's nonsense, and I tailor my site's output accordingly, it's my ass in the jackpot when the exact opposite turns out to be true. How am I supposed to set an example for my team? What should our standards be? Bing! Turn the page.
And I should be clear. I didn't even reach out on the Kenobi rumor. Why? Because I was lazy.
Fuck.
Oh, man. Because it came from such a seemingly ridiculous place, I wasn't even aware of it until people I very much trust had already reached out and reported, nah, it's nothing. A ding, I turned the page.
Fuck, I'm going. Oh, shit.
Peter, you can't speak Italian just because you have a mustache.
We're almost there, folks. So basically, studios have a choice. They can talk to the outlets that they know don't have agendas, who they can trust to handle even bad news responsibly, or they can spend the rest of the internet's life just getting walked over by the clowns who make stuff up when it's slow. Just turn the page.
This isn't a threat. I'm gonna do things the right way. At this point, if I lose my job, which is likely, maybe they're doing me a favor. But the next guy, but the next guy might not referring to whatever the hell that is, East Coast bias, who I would literally trust with my life, and the guy after that certainly won't. Ding! We did it. We did it. Wait, Adrian, we did it.
It's been 84 years.
That giant just tirade from Mike Cecchini or whatever was important to our topic. He talks about how he's being misled, and obviously he's very frustrated with that. But to me, this is what studios have to do. Studios have to get creative and try to control the information that is being leaked out there. Now, this could be for good or for bad, like the Snyder Cut, but they have to be able to dictate what type of rumors are floating out there, whether it's casting or how a show's going. They are trying to control the narrative. They are trying to limit the amount of nonsense that gets put out there by a slew of quote-unquote journalists. Now, Mike unfortunately seems to be caught in the crosshairs here a little bit and is obviously frustrated with that.
The idea of the source and insider has been around so long. It's one of those things that unfortunately it doesn't seem like it'll ever leave the culture, because it's been around in every aspect possible. You could even talk about in wrestling too, the dirt sheets, the observer. There is that element of people that want that information, to be the first to know something. There's other people that want that actual surprise. Unfortunately, when you have something like social media, that stuff gets amplified, and also misinformation can get amplified as well. And that's kind of the double-edged sword of social media. Plus also the toxicity and the stupidness and everything. That's also like the triple-edged sword or quadruple-edged sword. It becomes a fucking 4x4 at that point. You just get beat over the head with it over and over again.
There's a lot of edges. As we mentioned earlier in this episode, in terms of Star Wars trying to limit everything that was being put out there, Matt just mentioned with the Wrestling Observer, this is something that's been going on for a very long time. And yes, social media makes that a lot more complicated. There's a reason why studios will continue to use code names and they try to limit the amount of set photos and things that come out. It's because they are trying to control the narrative. They do not want you to see a set photo of something. They don't want you to hear about the drama that's going on behind the scenes. In terms of wrestling, depending on who you listen to, there have been several rumors that have been put out there almost intentionally by the WWE, and some people like Bruce Pritchard or Eric Bischoff may not necessarily agree with this and say, no, we didn't do that to try to mislead anyone. We did that because we were testing the audience or whatever the case may be. In some cases, intentionally misleading people to try to keep everything under wraps. Whether or not you want to agree with it is up for debate, but that's unfortunately what studios have to do now. They are trying to control the narrative.
So what this really means is take everything with a grain of salt. As Mike Cecchini said, is the lazy way out. I think that also becomes the obligation of the reader or listener to take that information with a grain of salt, see what adds up at the end of the day. As Mark Hughes and Mario Robles talked about with the Pattinson casting, WB was intentionally putting feelers out there with Armie Hammer and others to throw people off and to try to get the ball back in their court. That little bit of power they could still have on a possible casting, they want to try to get back because they gave full creative control to somebody. And we'll have to see how this goes for a lot of these sites. Maybe they'll start having to learn how to code. So that'll end this episode, guys. We got a Patreon. Down in the description, there's a link. If you feel like supporting our reading habit.
You want to get us some Hooked on Phonics, please do. Anything helps.
Yep, and you also get blooper reels. There's some blooper reels, and trust me, there is going to be a blooper reel from this one for sure.
It's gonna be a good one.
And make sure you guys check us out on Twitter. That's where we're most active. We are on other social media, but we're just more active on Twitter than anything. Even though that might change pretty soon because of some really stupid comments I just saw.
All right, you fucking cocksucker.
In case I don't see you.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night.